Well, I am so excited, Katie, when you actually filled out the questionnaire to be a guest and sent me the email and all of that. I read your questions and the answers that you gave to me, and then you sent me more about your memoir and your background. I knew this was going to be a good fit for our listeners of the Caregiver Cup podcast. And so
Thank you.
let me back up and ask you, can you just share about yourself and where you are current state today? And then we'll get back into your story.
Yeah, well, I am now primarily retired. I'm a grandmother to an almost 2-year-old, which has just been
Oh,
wonderful. First grandchild.
oh,
I live with my husband, who's still working full time in West Hartford, Connecticut, and my background was as a first of all a clinical social worker. And then a social work professor. I went back to school, got my PhD, and my main area of focus was aging and mental health.
okay.
And then I had my own parents, and kind of saw that it's not always easy even with all that good background. Yeah.
Yeah, so tell us about your parents and the story. I
Yeah.
know there are some pieces in there that were definitely challenging. I know
Yeah.
there was pieces in there that you had to make some hard decisions. So tell us about that.
Right. Well, in a way, I mean, I have been very lucky. The memoir is called The Pianist's Only Daughter, and the pianist is my father, who is now passed. But my mother and my dad were both very they were academics. He was a musician, piano teacher, really kind of a concert pianist at a certain level. And my mother was an English teacher and scholar and a poet.
Mhm.
And I was their only daughter, and a lot of in the beginning of the book kind of describes growing up with them and how they were a little bit there was a little bit of drama in their lives, and I was kind of part of that. And I think I became, what you might think of as the caregiving child or the parentified child to some extent, because they were having problems, and I was definitely my mother's confidant, but also felt a lot of sympathy for my dad until he basically left my mom because he was having an affair with another woman, and
Okay.
couldn't give that up. And I was about 14. So
Oh, that's
then
young.
had that, and a lot of the book kind of focuses just on that early part in a way to set the stage for later,
Okay.
when they my dad remarried, and I have a half brother who's much younger. And when my dad was about 72, his second wife fell in love with someone else,
Oh,
and
no.
they got divorced. And then my dad, almost like without missing a beat, is on the phone to me saying, "Do you think your mom would like to see me?" And it happened. My mom had Parkinson's disease, which we got her diagnosis, came around age 65. She was living near us in a senior living apartment in Maryland at that time. And I was like, "No, I don't think she'll mind seeing you," but I hadn't really pictured. And then it turns out that they reconciled. She moved back to Minnesota, where he lived, on this big country estate. Like, how convenient when you're, getting older
Mm.
and having
Yeah.
some chronic illnesses, and then the winters, and then the driveway and everything. So anyway, they
Yeah.
lived together, and they had a fairly good about 13 years. But her Parkinson's did continue to
Okay.
progress, and I was very involved in trying to help her, get the right doctor's visits and get the right medication and do the right thing. And I was working on trying to get them to move and live in some kind of senior housing. And then the big dramatic moment, as there often is, my mother fell and broke her hip coming into
Okay.
the house. There's
Mm.
like a one-step
Yeah.
concrete entry with a
Yeah.
door that goes out, just
Yeah.
like, not a good thing. She did
Right.
not use a walker or anything, even though she probably should have by then. And so she broke her hip, and that was kind of the beginning of a
Oh.
spiral where, um, oddly enough, and I don't think this is that uncommon, but it seemed sort of surprising to us at the time. It sort of set off a level of Parkinson's dementia that she hadn't had prior to the
Okay.
accident.
Okay. Were you
So
doing this both from afar too? Because
yeah, I was from afar so far.
oh,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, that
And
had to be even more nerve-wracking.
yeah, so I was kind of running back and forth, flying back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And I had already left my full-time job because my husband got a different job. So I was kind of trailing him and doing part-time work.
Okay.
But so it was a little easier. And, I had the privilege of having a husband making the money so that I didn't have to,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't struggling to pay my own bills.
But I can't even
So that's
imagine, Katie,
great.
the stress that you felt at that time.
Yeah,
Do you
it was a lot
remember
of
that?
stress. Yeah, it was a lot of stress, and it was a lot of decisions because she got into a rehabilitation center, as happens, like, really quickly after,
Okay.
they barely keep you in the hospital. She had a
Wow.
surgery for her hip.
Okay.
Um, and then they let her, one of the first, the incident that made me start writing my book was they discharged her on a Saturday evening
Oh
from the
my
hospital
goodness.
to a
Okay.
rehabilitation center. There was one nurse there to check her in and to take care of all these people. And he did not have the right Parkinson's medication. The room had linoleum hard floor and a single, hospital type bed, but without any bed rails. And there was no way we could get bed rails without a doctor's order until Monday.
Oh, geez.
She'd been trying to work with a
Oh,
PT person with a walker, but there was no walker there for her. And so the whole thing was just like a nightmare. And so that was kind of like the beginning. And there just were several incidents like that where you feel like I am someone who knows a lot about aging. I know a lot about nursing homes and hospital and healthcare. And yet I am just constrained by the situation. There's no way I can take my mother home. There's no way I can have her stay home with my dad right now. I have to leave her here. We have to we ended up putting like things around her bed so that she wouldn't fall out, like the wheelchair and a table. And it's like,
that's
it's like,
crazy. That's
that was just for the
crazy.
rest of the weekend. Then on Monday, she got bed rails, but that particular place about 2 weeks, maybe about 3 weeks later, actually did, she fell because they left her in her room alone in a recliner. And unfortunately, what had happened with her, and I guess this is not that unusual, she just could not remember that she had this bad hip that was
I
being,
suppose. Okay.
it was still, recovering. She was barely out of surgery a few weeks, and she really couldn't walk unassisted. So she'd like edge herself out of her chair, and then oops, so then they sent her to the hospital. So then I sent her to a different facility, and my
Okay.
father ended up, selling his house and moving into that same facility, but in independent living.
Okay.
So for a while, that was looking so good. And that's
Mm.
like a little lull in the story where, oh,
Sorry.
we're in the
Okay.
same place. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I'm still far away because at
Yeah.
that point we had moved from Maryland to California. Well, actually to Cleveland and then to California, but
Oh my
that's
goodness. Yeah.
partly because my husband's a science guy and he keeps getting these different jobs. But
Okay.
anyway, so we're in California. So then what happened was, though, her Medicare coverage for rehab ran out, as
Mm.
happens, because they make that decision when the person is not progressing
Okay.
anymore. And a
Okay.
lot of older people, it's really a sad thing because they could use physical therapy just to keep them from losing
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
abilities,
Right.
range of motion, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. But they may not be able to progress farther and actually, get all the way better
Better.
or much
Right.
better. So unfortunately, they said, well, we're going to stop coverage. So then that meant she had to move from the rehab center there to their higher floor, which was a dementia care unit.
Oh,
And they wouldn't put her in the other unit because she needed more supervision.
okay.
So then the dementia care unit turned out to be very low functioning group
Oh
of
no.
people and just did not seem appropriate. So then I was struggling again. Here's my dad living in the same place, but like sort of like a little campus in Minnesota. And I thought, oh my gosh, I got him all moved in. And the interesting thing about the fact that he's a pianist is every time
Yes.
he was going to move, he has this 7-foot Steinway grand piano.
Piano.
So that had moved in with him to his independent
Yeah.
living apartment.
Yeah.
And so eventually we moved them out to California, and she went into an independent freestanding memory care, and he came and lived with us. And
Okay.
his piano came and lived with us too.
Okay. Okay.
So then that was another sort of a calm time, but and that was basically how it was till the end of her life, which
Well,
came about a year later.
yeah.
She
Well,
lived about a year
I
in.
want to ask you about, how did you advocate? What were some of the things that you had to do to, I mean, you talked about having to move, you recognize the situation. Can you give us a little insight on, trying to be that advocate?
It really is hard because a lot of the places, a lot of the ways things work, if there's a certain diagnosis given, it sort of triggers a certain thing. And so when they put dementia on her chart,
Art.
even though it was not Alzheimer's, but it was a certain degree of confusion and forgetting.
Sure.
And it meant that she kept being like unable to really be trusted in her chair or
Hmm.
um, so I felt like I could not argue with the fact that they wanted to put her up in this. I did argue, but it didn't work
Okay.
in the dementia unit. So it did seem like, I mean, she could have stayed there. If we'd had to stay there, we could have done it. But I felt there must be a better way. Plus, I was still so far away. So then I
Sure. Sure.
started looking for places
You
in
started looking.
California.
Yeah.
And my mom had a pretty good pension and savings saved up from her career
Hmm.
as a professor. And that was good because we ended up in that time, which is now it's about 9 years ago that this happened, where we moved her to California. It was $11,000 a month at that time.
Yeah.
So, we paid out of pocket, then she got her everything, and, we could just apply it to that.
Right.
Um, but anyway, she had a good situation in that memory care
Good.
until unfortunately we realized there's things that I learned along the way, even as a person who'd been a geriatric social worker. There's still things, you don't really know until you know, until you understand. And one is that someone who really isn't going to walk should not sit in like a basic traveling wheelchair, like the kind that,
Okay.
you see them all over. There's like a
Right.
wheelchair, go sit in your wheel. She needed a custom wheelchair. First I knew she needed a pad. So we tried to get her
They
all these
look
different
so
pillows
uncomfortable.
and pads and everything.
Yeah.
But really she needed a custom wheelchair. But unfortunately, she developed bed sores. And
Mm,
that's how she died, was
yeah.
because her bed sore got so bad.
Hmm.
And so we had put her into a hospice at a nursing home after trying to treat the bed sore unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
And my father would say, "What a way to die. What a
I know
sad
it.
way to die." And it was.
Hmm.
But so
Hmm.
then my dad, who was the one who had been kind of like the difficult parent. I had
Okay.
sort of an easy parent and a difficult parent. And
Okay.
earlier in life, if I had thought, okay, the difficult parent's going to outlive the easy parent, I would have been like, oh no, because in a way it was hard.
Hmm.
He had a lot of beautiful qualities, a wonderful pianist. A lot of people loved him, but he was kind of controlling and kind of held on really to like he just really wanted that piano wherever he was. He wanted certain things, he really insisted that he could drive for a long time. We really had to fight him on that, and his
Hmm.
driving was not great. So he ended up living in our house. This was while my mom was there, and then after. And then about another several months, well, about almost a year later, we moved to Connecticut and we
Okay.
brought him along, but I had to break it to him that my husband and I were not going to have him live in our house again. And he was
Okay.
quite sad for a little
Hmm.
bit and
Yeah.
angry. But then he kind of got with the program, and I think he kind of recognized that maybe it would be all right. He could have another independent senior apartment, and so we
Right.
got him set up, and his piano fit, and
Okay.
and he kind of became like, the big man on campus for a little while at this other senior living here in
Okay.
West Hartford, and actually had a fairly nice life for a while again.
Yeah.
And then I was just doing things like getting his groceries and, we'd sort of help him out with things. I
Sure.
took him to the doctor all the time. Um, and then things happened again. He had a lady friend, and that was nice for a while. It was lovely. And then unfortunately she had Alzheimer's and
Okay.
she had to move to memory care. And then that was a big loss for him and upset him. And then I'm sort of like trying to soothe him, and and
Yeah.
it's sort of the earlier part of my book kind of illustrated how when you're a daughter kind of put in that position, it comes back, when your person is old, your parents are old, you still feel like, oh no, I better help, I gotta make
Yeah.
sure they're not unhappy, because something I must be able to do something. It's something to do with me, and I must be responsible in some
Oh
way.
my gosh, you're speaking my language. I did that pressure to myself too,
So hard
and
to overcome that.
it's
It
very
just keeps
hard.
coming back too, even though you know it, it
Yeah.
keeps coming back, and you realize because your, like, chest is tightening and you're like,
Right.
your body tells you that you're all stressed out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So
the
how did
final
you overcome that, or did you just work
I
through
just
it?
I just had to keep trying to work through it, and the
Yeah.
worst was still to come with him, unfortunately. That the end of his life was kind of a sad situation because it came during the COVID pandemic, and he fell, broke several bones, had to
Mm.
go to a nursing home. Then they didn't feel like he could even be really in regular assisted living, let alone independent. He never could really walk well again, and, so I basically left him where he was, but in, like, a little grade above the rehab nursing home, so he was
Yeah.
getting, a lot of hands-on care,
Okay.
and, I got him a little, Yamaha,
Keyboard?
keyboard,
Yeah.
and some of his music, and his a nice CD player because he had all these CDs that he had recorded, and he loved to listen to his own CDs.
Okay.
And people wrote to him, former students wrote beautiful notes and things to him, but it was hard because, as his family, as you recall from COVID, we were not allowed to go in
No.
mostly at all. We were
Ugh.
just over the phone, and fortunately, he did not have dementia. He was able to use the phone. He was a little like people get a little less judgment, a little less capability, but he still, it
Yeah.
made a big difference. So we could talk on the phone.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of that talking on the phone was him being miserable.
Yeah. And so
Uh,
it is, it's hard because you see them so unhappy. You
yeah,
see that you have your back's against the wall or you're hitting a brick
right,
wall,
right,
and all you can do is offer the support that you can.
right.
Yeah.
And I've written I write some things on Medium. Medium.com is a
Okay.
platform where people put essays, and I thought maybe I would send you an email with the
Yes, please.
3 I have, like, 3 little ones about caregiving, and, I'll send you, what they call the friend link, so then you could
Okay.
post it for your listeners.
Wonderful.
That
Thank
means
you.
they could get it without having to be members or pay,
Okay.
but a one of the things there is that, you feel a lot of guilt, and then it's sort of mixed with resentment because you don't
Mhm.
wanna feel guilt. You
Right.
sort of realize,
Yeah.
"I shouldn't be responsible for this," and yet you might be the one, you kinda have to recognize, "Well, I'm the one who can at least do something, if anything."
Right.
But, one of the things I noted in one of those essays was that your older parent is struggling with these chronic conditions with aging and all the effects, and it's sad, and you're grieving for that as well as feeling guilty, but it's not your fault. That's going to
Mm,
happen if you walked away and never did another thing for them. They are going to have that same situation, but
good
probably
point.
worse.
Good
So the
point.
fact that you're engaged, that you're trying to do whatever you can do, even if feels like it's not enough,
Mhm.
you know, everybody has to, unless they die sooner, they have to go through some things with aging that are not
Yeah.
pleasant.
I
And
remember driving over to my mom's house, and this was in her last year where she was starting to really have problems with staying happy, and mental illness was setting in, and the depression was setting in because her cancer disease was just progressing. And
oh
I
gosh,
had to I had to go ahead and on the way there kind of do a pep talk with myself saying,
right,
okay, I'm going to stay upbeat, I'm going to find humor, I'm going to be a duck and let some things roll off my back, because you get
excellent,
there and you can't mirror their state.
right,
You try to
right,
share something else that they can think about, or hey,
right.
I saw this on the way here, or do you remember
Hmm.
when we used to do that? It
Hmm.
is because they only see the tunnel that they're in right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So it's kind of up to you to try not to get sucked into that tunnel too,
yeah,
because then you're not as much of a help, and then you're struggling yourself. Yeah,
right,
and I think in the book, the good thing that really happened, and it sort of helped me sort of decide, sometimes if you're writing a memoir, it's not like a novel. A novel, you sort of plan. A
right.
memoir, you kind of have to take reality and decide, how am I going to tell this? But
Hmm.
at the end of my dad's life, I I feel like there were some positives where I felt more kind of pure sort of appreciation for who he was and empathy. And he, at that point, really recognized that, I was his person at that point. I mean, he was grateful, and that helped. And sort of like we um, connected through humor. And that was good because even though
Nice,
he's like basically bedridden, not doing well, he somehow still had a sense of humor.
nice.
And I was able to recall some things, kind of like reminiscence of
Good.
things that were funny from the past. And we could share that. And that was nice.
Yeah, that's so important to be
Yeah.
able to do that. And I found that, pulling out photo albums and saying, "Do you remember this picture and what we did?" And it
Yeah.
just helps because, they
Absolutely.
feel. My mom would say, and my dad too, my dad passed away with pancreatic cancer. And my
Oh,
dad would say, my brain is really good, my dad would say, and I wanted to do things and I could remember things, but my body just doesn't respond. And
yeah.
so, and it's like, okay, but your brain's good. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this. And then he would say,
Yeah.
oh, I wish we could do it one more time, and
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, those are the things that, hurt the
Yeah.
worst. It's the aging body and the aging mind that
Yes.
why I always think about this is just way out there, but it's like, why do we have to end our life that way? Or why do people have, I know it's part of life and it's a circle of life, but it's,
I know.
he was a pianist and he worked, and your mom worked so
Yeah.
hard, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's sad, and it's kind of frustrating because you feel like maybe these extra longevity, if there's not the quality, and I feel
mhm,
like with both my parents, they kind of ran out of quality, about
that's
a
true.
year or 2 before the end of their lives, and,
Hmm.
that made it hard,
Hmm.
and as the daughter, as the person kind of responsible for them, even though I wasn't doing the hands-on care, I still felt somehow
Well, you were. Yeah, you were managing it
I
all.
was managing it all, and I think it's just important to, cut yourself some slack when you're that person, whether you're doing the hands-on care or not, and if you are doing the hands-on care, try to get as much help as you possibly can from other sources,
Yeah.
and they may tell you, "Oh, no, I don't want that," but you just gotta say, "Yeah, but I can't do it. I cannot
Yeah.
do all of this,"
Well,
and,
let's use your expertise or your experience because you had your mom and your dad both in
mhm,
facilities.
right.
What advice would you have for a caregiver that I have two, a caregiver that has a loved one in a facility? What
Mhm.
advice would you give them to, and for the lack of a term, stay on top of it all?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think getting to know the charge nurse and if you unlike when it was COVID, I really couldn't go in and meet with all the people, but now you could again. Um, Try to get to know the night staff too.
Okay.
Um, my dad had a lot of issues at night where there were fewer aides and the regular charge nurse wasn't around, and it seemed like he had a lot of anxiety and
Mhm.
they'd kind of tuck him in his bed and he couldn't get out, so
Okay.
he's in the bed, he's ringing his little buzzer, and then they're getting annoyed with him because he's ringing his little buzzer again and
Sure.
he was maybe too hot or he wanted to have his blankets, he had a lot of different things and
Okay.
I was in the email and on the phone several times about that, trying to say that I really did think they needed to be more patient with him.
Good.
And then finally, we had a psych consult for the psychiatric nurse practitioner, and he was given something for his anxiety to take
Okay.
at night, and it did help a lot. And that's something I would not be afraid of. When someone is in a state where, they're not gonna live that much longer anyway.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's no harm in having a
Yeah.
psych consult if they're having either anxiety, depression, or a lot of behavioral issues like getting all angry and yelling, which he was also doing. That was part of his
Mhm.
situation at night is he would yell at the aides. And of course,
Mhm.
then they don't love that and they don't
No.
really pay attention. So it was
No.
like a vicious cycle. It
Yeah.
was sad, but
Well,
he
and
got a
it
lot
is.
better with some medication. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if they hear from you and see you and you get to know
Yes.
them, they kind of understand, and
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think it's no different than raising a child and being partner with the teachers and the
Right.
principal and the school. You have to do your
Right.
part there.
Yeah.
They don't understand, and your loved
Yeah.
one can't always be the voice. Yeah.
And I feel like if someone is in this later stage of life where they really aren't gonna get up and around and out and about too much, it does seem like it's best if you can live close to where they're in their
Mhm.
facility. And sometimes older people sort of arrange, they think, "Well, I'm gonna go here where it's close to my old house
Yeah.
and you're far, far away." But then if you're the
Yeah.
one who's responsible, that's just too much for you,
Yeah.
and you might have to arrange for them to move, and if they're mostly their lives are in that facility and in that
They
room and
won't know.
everything and on the TV, you know,
Yeah, they
it's
won't
it's
know.
better for them to be close to you, and then you can visit regularly because that's the number one thing is to get in there and see how they're doing and help them, clear things out in their room. Because a
Yeah.
lot of the staff, they only do a certain amount. They really aren't tending to all the little details.
Right, right.
Right.
And looking at their clothes and making sure their clothes are there and they didn't lose
Right,
something of their
right.
clothes when they did the
Mhm.
wash. And I remember all
Yeah,
of that with my grandma. And my
yeah.
grandma was in there too.
Mhm.
If somebody is on the fence and they're thinking, well, should they live like your dad? He lived with you for a while, but I had that situation with me, Katie. My mom, after my dad passed away, we tried to have my mom live with me, and
Mhm.
she was miserable. She
Aw.
was owly, she was angry, um, she wanted her attention all the time, and both of
Right.
us had to work, and it worked out for probably 6 months, but she
Wow.
was not happy, and so we found her a senior living apartment,
Mhm.
which was an adjustment, but
Yeah.
um, I know for me it was hard conversations. Do you have any advice for somebody that's looking at the next phase for their loved one?
Yeah. I think it's very hard to have someone live with you unless they're quite mild-mannered, and my
Hmm.
dad was not overly mild-mannered. He was okay, but, we actually ended up getting a different house that he could live in with us because the house we originally had in California would not have been
Hmm.
good. So we found a place where he could have a space for his piano and a space for his computer and a bedroom and his own bath, all on the first floor. And I mean, when I think about what we what we went through, it's ridiculous, but there we
We
are. And
we were seriously thinking, my husband and I were seriously thinking about building a mother's home onto the side of our home.
people do that. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And, in some cases that might be a good idea. And there's sort of a point where actually, like with my mother, after she got through the phase where she was always falling out of bed or falling off of her chair because she was trying to get up, she really couldn't get up.
No,
And she probably could have lived in a little mother-in-law space off of a house with
with
round the clock
care.
aides.
Yeah,
But that does add up even more than, it can be even more than a good facility sometimes, depending
yeah.
the way things are these days. But I think for us, we probably would have kept him there. We kept him there as long as my mom was alive and as long as we lived in that house. And then when we had to come here, um, a few things about it were just like, we just didn't want to have the daily responsibility for him, because if we went on a trip, he'd be alone in our house. And that was
Hmm.
kind of starting to get a little concerned about him, being safe by himself in our house.
Yeah.
And he always wanted the heat way up
Oh, yes.
or the air conditioning not on, or, he really got cold. And my
Yeah.
husband's the opposite.
Yeah.
And, he played the piano a lot, and so there was a lot of that throughout the house, and, a lot of that I didn't mind, but I could see the handwriting on the wall that he would be better off where he had dinner provided, which is what we ended up getting him, with the
Yeah.
independent living. And the other thing was, after my mom passed, it didn't take him long, and this I talk about in the book, and there's some humor. There's
Yeah.
definitely some humor in the book. Um, he was looking for another girlfriend,
Yeah. He needed the socialization. Yeah.
and he, on 2 different occasions, he met people out. Like, he met a woman in the park, and he went out and found this receptionist from the memory care where my mom had lived, and tried to ask her out. And so we started to think he'd just be better off in senior living where there'd be some other
Yes.
ladies, and maybe and then he did. He met this
Yeah.
girlfriend who was really, kind of a godsend for him for a
Yeah.
while until she didn't
Oh,
do as well. But he
yeah.
had someone to really focus on and focus his love and his attention on for quite a while.
Yeah.
And that was wonderful. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I love the fact when you sent me this email too, you said, can you explain this a little bit more? You said all family caregiving stories are family stories.
right.
I
Yeah.
love that. This is a great way to kind of wrap it all up here.
Yeah, I thought of that as sort of a tagline for my book because
Yeah.
my whole story felt like the way we behave towards our people in later life is so based on who we were as a child, who they were as our parents. Um, all my feelings of trying to make everything all better for them was from the early years.
Mhm.
And then also some of the resentment I had for my dad came from when I was a teenager, and he
Yeah.
was not nice to my mom and had an affair, and I knew all that, and I was very
Yeah.
upset with him at that point. So
Yeah.
let's talk about mixed feelings. I had a lot of mixed feelings about my dad.
Well, and I think that's really true because from a caregiving perspective, it's, and we said this before we hit the recording, not one size fits all, and we all
Right,
have to caregive. And there are so many caregivers out there that are caregiving with all that past trauma, with all that
right.
past
Even
situation, and
yeah, even like abuse and such that I
do
think
the best.
is
Yeah.
really, very, very hard. And, I think as the younger generation, if that's our situation, we have to watch out for our own mental health and not force yourself to do too much if you really have not been able to resolve that trauma with your older parent. But it's
Yeah.
very hard if there's no resources, and you have to work hard to find resources. And I would say check with the area agencies on aging, check with um, if you need to what's it called I'm trying to think, uh, adult protective services.
Mm,
If
okay.
someone that you're involved with is really not doing well and not taking good care of themselves, instead of you rescuing them because you don't feel good about that, you don't feel like you can deal with it, you
Yeah.
can contact adult protective services, say, this is my aunt, this is my mother, and she's just not doing well, she's self-neglecting, and I really don't have the resources to help her. And then
Right.
someone else will, you know they
Yeah.
can
I
maybe
think
get them on
I think it's
medication.
so key to educate yourself and be able to go ahead and saying, I think more caregivers go into it saying, I have to do it.
Right,
But you
right,
have to do it, but you don't have to, I don't know how else to say it. You don't have to do it all.
right.
You
You don't have to
can,
do it all.
you have to
And
look at all of the options and all of the resources and
yeah,
do what's
and
best for you.
if you have the money for even like a little investment of like a few hours with a geriatric care manager,
Okay.
someone you often pay per hour, that would probably come out of your pocket to kind
Hmm.
of help you decide, is my parent capable of living alone? If so, what do I need to do to that apartment or the house to make it better? What should I be thinking about? What are some of the resources this person can help me figure out? Because that's what they do, is help you. And it can be a very temporary, it seems expensive, but it's like sometimes it's like over $100 an hour, kind of like an attorney or something, but
Sure. Sure.
it can be very well worthwhile.
I agree. It could be worthwhile and being able to
Yeah.
identify that and then making those decisions based on that. Oh,
Right.
this was so
Right.
insightful. And
Thank you.
I'm going to put your memoir in the link at the bottom in the show
Great.
notes so that everybody
Great.
has a resource to read. I think the
Yeah.
pianist only daughter you have,
Yeah.
and it's called a
Yeah.
memoir. I love the graphics on the front of it
Thank you.
with the piano. Now I'm going to
Yeah.
remember the piano that
Yeah.
moved everywhere. And
Right.
then,
Right.
is that you
As
as a
the
child?
little
Y-
girl with my mom, and
Mom
there's the nursing home scene with the pushing the wheelchair, yeah.
pushing the wheelchair. Yeah, it just is full circle. And what a beautiful way to go ahead and share your story, but also providing tips to us through your story to go ahead and saying we're not alone. Everybody goes
No,
through
that's
this.
right. That's
Most
right.
everybody will go through
Yeah.
something like this,
Yeah.
and we all have that past that we have to go ahead and work through as we're caring for our
Right.
aging
Right.
parents. Yes.
Well, this has just been wonderful, Kathy. Thank you so much for having
Oh,
me.
you
And I
too.
just think you're doing you're doing, as they say in some circles, you're doing the Lord's work, right? You really are doing
This
some
is 4 years on
great
the
work.
Caregiver Cup podcast, and
Fantastic.
I just started just saying, you know what, I'm going to get behind this microphone and share my caregiving stories, my mom, my
Fantastic.
dad, my
Yeah,
spouse, and just
fantastic.
sharing that. Unfortunately, during that journey, I lost my mom and my dad, but
Right.
my spouse is still here fighting his cancer battle and he's doing wonderful. So we're just
Good,
plucking
good.
along. So,
Glad to hear that. Yeah. Well, it's
well,
great talking to you. Thanks.
yeah, it's been a pleasure.